For 4 days, the Wind River Range swallowed every trace of Eleanor Voss. Search helicopters out of Fremont County crossed the same ridgelines until their fuel gauges forced them home. And by the fourth night, the incident commander posted at the staging area on Sinks Canyon Road had stopped saying find and started saying recover. Eleanor Voss was 42 years old, founder and managing partner of Voss Capital Partners, a private investment firm headquartered on the 38th floor of 233 South Wacker Drive in Chicago. She had built the firm from a single office and $4.2 million in seed capital into a $9.6 billion portfolio in 11 years, a fact financial journalists mentioned in nearly every profile of her, usually in the same paragraph as the fact that she had been blind since age 14, following a car accident on Interstate 80 outside Cheyenne that took her sight and her mother in the same night. She had learned to run boardrooms the way she had learned to run everything else since, by trusting what she could touch, hear, and measure, and refusing to let anyone assume those tools made her lesser. That week, she'd flown a chartered Cessna Caravan into a private airstrip outside Lander, Wyoming, to meet face-to-face with the ownership group of a mineral rights consortium she intended to acquire for $340 million. Somewhere over the eastern face of Wind River Peak, air traffic control lost her transponder. No mayday, no debris field the FAA's preliminary report could explain. Just silence, and then a slow unraveling of a search that covered 11,000 acres and found nothing. 41 miles away, in a two-bedroom house on Route 3 outside the town of Dubois, Caleb Renner was helping his 9-year-old daughter Sadie finish a diorama of the solar system for her fourth-grade science fair when the county dispatcher's truck pulled into his gravel driveway. Caleb was 39, a former backcountry ranger with the Shoshone National Forest who'd left the Forest Service 6 years earlier, not long after his wife, Danielle, died of a pulmonary embolism 11 days after Sadie was born. He raised Sadie alone since, working seasonal trail maintenance contracts and telling almost no one in town the reason he'd stopped taking permanent postings, that he couldn't risk being 3 days deep in a canyon if something happened to her. That night, after Sadie was asleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a topographic map spread under the lamp, tracing a route no search team had walked, and began packing a bag he told himself he wasn't going to need. Caleb didn't leave that night. He couldn't, not with Sadie asleep down the hall and no one else to call at 11 o'clock except his sister-in-law, Marissa, who lived 20 minutes east in Dubois and covered for him during 2 wildfire seasons already. He phoned her at 5:40 the next morning. She didn't ask many questions either, just told him to bring Sadie's backpack, she'll get her to school, and to be careful, the way she always did. He dropped Sadie off at 6:15. She stood on Marissa's porch in her coat, still half asleep, and asked when he'd be back. He told her 2 days, maybe 3, and she nodded the way kids do when they've learned not to ask for promises their parent can't keep. He hugged her longer than usual. She noticed. She always noticed. By 7, he was parked on a pullout on Forest Road 517, well outside the official staging perimeter, studying the same topographic map from the night before. The county's grid had been built around the Cessna's last known heading and a debris field model that assumed a controlled glide descent. Caleb had spent 9 years reading crash sites for the Forest Service before he ever wore a search and rescue vest, and he didn't trust that model. A plane losing power over that ridge in a crosswind out of the southwest wouldn't glide anywhere close to where the map said. It would get shoved north into the basin above Torrey Creek, the same basin the search teams had cleared in a single afternoon pass and marked complete. He crossed into that basin a little after 9, moving off-trail through lodgepole stands still heavy with old snowpack in the shadowed draws. 2 hours in, he found a scorched branch snapped at an angle no wind could produce, hanging low over a game trail, bark peeled back in a straight diagonal line consistent with something metal passing through the canopy at speed. He knelt, photographed it on a disposable camera he still carried out of habit, and kept moving north along the fall line the branch suggested. An hour later, at the base of a talus slope, he found a shard of aircraft-grade aluminum wedged between two rocks, edges bright and unweathered. 10 yards past it, arranged in a line too straight to be accidental, 3 stones stacked in a small deliberate cairn, then a fourth lying flat 6 feet beyond it, then nothing. Caleb stood over the cairn a long moment. He'd built enough of them himself, teaching new rangers how to mark a route when you couldn't trust your eyes to remember it. 3 and 1. A pattern. Someone had built this walking, not lying still, which told him 2 things at once: that whoever left this trail had survived the crash long enough to move, and that they'd been counting their steps in the dark or the fog, marking the trail the only way they could without seeing it. He looked around at the terrain, steep, broken, no clean sight lines anywhere, and understood with a certainty that settled into his chest like cold water that the person who left this trail hadn't been navigating by landmarks at all.
He followed the cairn line for another quarter-mile before it stopped making sense. The stones ran out at the edge of a boulder field, and beyond it, the ground dropped into a narrow ravine choked with deadfall. Whoever had built the markers had either lost the pattern here or lost the strength to keep building it. Caleb crouched at the last cairn and turned in a slow circle, reading the ground the way he'd read 100 search sectors before. Broken branches at waist height rather than knee height, which meant an adult moving upright, not crawling. A depression in a patch of mud that could have been a boot heel, dragging slightly on the left side. He called out. His voice came back off the rock walls and died in the wind. No answer. It was past 4 in the afternoon by then, the light already starting to slant gold and low through the pines, and Caleb knew from 9 years of experience exactly how fast that light would go. He had maybe 2 hours before the temperature at this elevation dropped past the point where a person without shelter stopped being able to warm themselves back up. He picked his way down into the ravine, testing each log before trusting his weight to it, moving faster than was strictly safe because the alternative, another night unaccounted for, was one he wasn't willing to consider. Near the bottom of the ravine, wedged beneath an overhang where a slab of granite had sheared away from the slope decades ago, he found a strip of torn fabric caught on a branch. Pale blue, expensive-looking, the kind of fabric that didn't belong to anyone who lived out here. He picked it up, turned it over once, and kept moving. That was when he heard it. Not a voice, a sound, deliberate, rhythmic, 2 short strikes and a pause, repeating, metal against stone. He'd trained volunteers on exactly this signal years ago, 3 sets of 3, universal distress. This wasn't quite that, but it was close enough, patient enough, that he knew immediately that it wasn't the wind or a branch working loose. It was a person conserving energy, striking the same interval again and again because they'd decided that was the only thing left within their power to do. He moved toward it, calling out again, and this time a voice answered. Hoarse, cracked from days without enough water, but clear enough to carry his name back to him before he'd even given it. Is someone there? He found her in a shallow hollow beneath the overhang, wrapped in what was left of a suit jacket, one leg drawn up at an angle that told him it was broken before she said a word. Her face was pale under several days of exposure, lips cracked, and her eyes, open, alert, tracking the sound of his footsteps with total precision, didn't move toward him the way a sighted person's would. They fixed instead on a point just past his shoulder, adjusting only when he spoke again, and Caleb understood in the half-second before she confirmed it herself exactly who he'd found and exactly what he was looking at. My name's Eleanor Voss. I can't see you, but I can hear that you came alone. I did. Name's Caleb Renner. I've been tracking your markers for the better part of a mile. Something in her shoulders eased just slightly at that. The cairns worked. They're the only reason I found this ravine instead of walking past it. He knelt beside her, keeping his voice level, and told her what he was about to do before he did it, a habit left over from 9 years of talking frightened hikers through triage. He checked her pulse at her wrist, found it thin and fast, and asked her to tell him where it hurt worst. She said her left leg, below the knee, and that she thought it had been broken since the second day, though she'd stopped being sure which day was which sometime around the second night. He worked quickly, a splint from a length of dead branch and strips torn from his own shirt, water from his canteen given in small, careful sips because he knew what happened to a dehydrated stomach that got too much too fast. She didn't flinch when he touched the leg, just went very still and breathed through it, and he found himself grateful for that, for someone who understood without being told that stillness helped more than struggle. "You're the first person who's touched me in 4 days who didn't ask if I was really Eleanor Voss before they asked if I was hurt. Didn't know who you were until you said your name. That's the first time that's happened to me in about 15 years. He didn't answer that, just kept working, and something about the silence seemed to steady her more than anything he could have said. When he judged her stable enough to move, he explained what he was about to do, a fireman's carry, her weight settled across his shoulders, and asked if that was all right before he lifted her, the same way he'd asked any survivor, sighted or not. She said it was, and gripped the strap of his pack with both hands as he stood. The climb out of the ravine took the better part of an hour, the light going from gold to gray to the flat blue of early dusk, while he chose each foothold with the same care he'd used finding her. She didn't talk much during that climb, save once when a branch snapped under his boot and she asked without alarm, only curiosity, whether they'd crossed back onto the game trail yet. He asked how she knew there had been a game trail at all. "Different sound. Packed dirt instead of loose rock. I've had a lot of practice listening to ground." By the time they reached the trailhead where he'd left his truck, full dark had settled over the basin, and his satellite messenger, the only device out here reliable enough to trust, finally caught a signal steady enough to send. He typed a short message to Ron Petrie. "Subject located. Ambulatory injury. Requesting ground extraction at FR 517 mile marker 4. He didn't mention her name. Some habits, he was learning, applied to more than just terrain. She sat beside him in the cab while they waited, wrapped in the emergency blanket from his pack, and after a long, quiet stretch, she said, "Someone tried to kill me up there. I don't think it was the storm."
Caleb didn't answer right away. He'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do to someone mid-crisis was rush past what they'd just said, so he let the truck's heater fill the silence for a moment, and then he asked her to tell him what she meant. She told him about the noise, a hard, flat crack from somewhere beneath the cabin floor of the Cessna, seconds before the plane pitched hard to the left and the pilot's voice went from calm to nothing at all. Not an engine failure, she said. She'd flown enough charter routes to know what an engine failure sounded like, the shudder and cough of it. This had been sharp, localized, over before it registered. "I told myself I was wrong," she said. "For 4 days I told myself I was wrong, because the alternative meant someone wanted me dead badly enough to plan it, and I couldn't lie in that ravine and hold that thought and still keep myself alive." Caleb thought about the aluminum shard he'd found in the talus field, edges too bright and too clean for 4 days of weather. He hadn't mentioned it. He still didn't, not yet, until Ron's truck came bouncing up the fire road with its light bar cutting through the dark, and 2 EMTs jumped out to take over the things he no longer had the equipment to do. They loaded her onto a gurney at 9:40 that night. Before they closed the ambulance doors, she reached out and found his sleeve, gripping it with more strength than he expected from someone who'd spent 4 days without food. "What's your name again? I want to remember it right." "Caleb Renner." "I won't forget it," she said, and then the doors shut and the ambulance pulled out on Route 3 to St. John's Health in Jackson, lights strobing red against the tree line until the road curved and took them out of sight. Ron stayed behind long enough to take Caleb's statement, jotting notes on a county incident form under a headlamp balanced on the truck's tailgate. When Caleb mentioned the aluminum shard, still in his pack wrapped in a spare sock, Ron's pen stopped moving. "You're saying somebody rigged that plane?"
I'm saying I found metal that shouldn't have looked the way it looked, and she told me she heard something that shouldn't have happened. I'm not an investigator, Ron, but I know what 4-day-old wreckage looks like, and that wasn't it. Ron bagged the fragment himself, logged it into evidence with a case number written on a strip of masking tape, and told Caleb the FBI's Denver field office would likely want to talk to him once word got out who he'd found. Caleb said he didn't much care about talking to anyone, he just wanted to get home to his daughter, and Ron, who had known him 9 years and had never once heard him say a sentence like that about anything other than Sadie, didn't push. It was past midnight when Caleb pulled into Marissa's driveway. Sadie had left the porch light on for him. She always did, whether he asked her to or not. And through the front window he could see her asleep on the couch, waiting up long past her bedtime, a paperback open face down on her chest. He carried Sadie up to the guest bed without waking her, the way he'd done 100 times after late shifts, and sat for a while afterwards on the porch steps with Marissa, telling her only the parts that wouldn't scare her, that he'd found the woman alive, that she was safe now, that he was home. He didn't mention the aluminum shard or the sound Eleanor Voss described hearing beneath the cabin floor of a plane. Some things he needed to sit with alone first. 2 days later, the story broke nationally. Every outlet from the Casper Star-Tribune to the network morning shows ran some version of the same headline: "The missing billionaire, blind since childhood, found alive in the Wind River backcountry by an off-grid local after search teams had already stood down." Reporters descended on Dubois within 48 hours, camping outside the Fremont County Sheriff's substation on Ramshorn Street, hungry for any word from the man who'd found her. Caleb gave one brief statement to a deputy at the station and refused every interview request after that, more concerned with keeping Sadie's school routine intact than explaining himself to a camera. It was Thursday evening, 6 days after the crash, when the first sign of real trouble arrived. Caleb was in the driveway replacing a headlight in his truck when a dark gray Suburban with Colorado plates slowed at the end of Route 3 and idled there for a nearly full minute before continuing on. He didn't think much of it until it passed again 20 minutes later, this time parking on the shoulder just past the tree line at the edge of his property, 2 men inside, neither getting out. He sent Sadie to finish her homework at the kitchen table, out of sight of the front windows, and called Ron on his cell. "Probably reporters," Ron said. "We've had 3 vans try to get up your road already this week. Reporters don't sit in an unmarked Suburban with their engine running for 20 minutes. Reporters knock." He watched from the window until the vehicle finally pulled away at dusk, and that night, once Sadie was asleep, he took his rifle down from above the mudroom door and checked it, something he hadn't done since he'd stopped carrying it on patrol. The knock came the next evening, just past 7. 2 men on his porch, dressed in outdoor gear that looked right at a glance and wrong the moment Caleb actually looked. Jackets too clean, boots with tread barely worn. They introduced themselves as private investigators retained by a member of the Voss Capital Board, following up on the circumstances of the crash for an internal review. The taller one did the talking. The shorter one's eyes moved past Caleb's shoulder toward the lit kitchen window, toward the shape of a child's homework spread across the table, and lingered there half a second too long. Caleb kept his body square in the doorway, blocking the sight line, and told him evenly that he'd already given his full statement to the sheriff's office and had nothing further to add. The taller man smiled, said he understood, and handed Caleb a business card with a name and a Denver phone number on it. Caleb watched their taillights disappear down Route 3 before he went back inside, locked the door, and sat down across from Sadie at the kitchen table, doing his best not to let her see that his hands weren't quite steady.
He didn't sleep much that night. He sat at the kitchen table after Sadie went to bed, turning the business card over in his hands. Marcus Doyle, Sentinel Risk Advisory, Denver, Colorado, and running the 2 men's faces back through his memory, the way he used to run a poacher's story back through his head, looking for the seam where it stopped holding together. Private investigators didn't usually work in pairs who didn't introduce themselves by full name. They didn't usually let their eyes drift toward a 9-year-old's math homework mid-conversation. At 6 a.m., he called Ron, then called the number on the card himself, using the landline instead of his cell.
It rang 4 times and went to a voicemail box that hadn't been set up. He called the Fremont County Sheriff's Office next and asked them to run the plate he'd written down off the Suburban. By 9, Ron called back to tell him the plate came back registered to a rental agency out of Denver International, leased 3 days earlier to a shell company with no listed employees and a business address that turned out to be a UPS mailbox on Colfax Avenue. "That's not a PI firm," Ron said. "That's nothing." 340 miles away, in a private room at St. John's Health in Jackson, Eleanor Voss was hearing something similar from a different direction. An FBI agent named Priya Anand, out of the Denver field office, sat beside her bed going through the preliminary lab results on the aluminum fragment Caleb had turned over. The metal showed residue consistent with a low-yield explosive charge, professionally sourced, the kind used in controlled demolition rather than anything a hobbyist could assemble. Someone had placed it in the Cessna's avionics bay, timed to detonate over terrain remote enough that a crash would look, to anyone who wasn't looking closely, like weather. Agent Anand asked Eleanor who at Voss Capital had access to her flight itinerary before departure. Eleanor answered slowly, working through 11 years of names, partners, an operations director, board members who'd sat across from her in 100 meetings, and never once, as far as she'd known, wished her anything but continued success. She gave the agent 4 names. 2 of them, she admitted, were people she'd trusted completely. "I built that firm assuming loyalty could be measured the same way I measured everything else. Numbers, track record. I never accounted for the variable that somebody might just want what I have." When Agent Anand mentioned almost in passing that a man named Caleb Renner in Fremont County had reported 2 individuals showing up at his home posing as private investigators, Eleanor sat up straighter than her leg brace made comfortable. "He has a daughter," she said. It wasn't a question. Agent Anand looked up from her notes, surprised Eleanor knew that detail at all. Caleb hadn't mentioned it to the press, hadn't mentioned it to anyone official, but Eleanor had heard it in his voice on the drive down the mountain, the particular strain in a man rushing to get somewhere, and she hadn't forgotten it. "Get agents to that house today," she said. "Whoever did this isn't finished, and he's the only loose end they know by name." The agents didn't make it in time. Caleb was in the driveway again that evening, this time checking the truck's oil, when the gray Suburban came back a 3rd time. No idling this time, no pretense. It turned straight up his gravel drive and stopped less than 20 feet from the porch. Both men got out fast, and this time neither of them reached for a business card. "Sadie, inside, lock the door," Caleb said, low and even, already moving to put himself between the vehicle and the house. She didn't argue. 9 years old, and she already knew the difference between his regular voice and the one that meant "move now," and she was through the door and turning the deadbolt before either man had closed half the distance across the yard. The taller one, Doyle, kept his hands visible, but the shorter one's jacket hung wrong on the left side, weighted in a way that had nothing to do with tools. "We just need to know what you told the FBI," Doyle said. "That's all. Then we're gone." "Already told them everything," Caleb said. "It's filed. Whatever you're looking for, it's not sitting in my head anymore." Doyle's expression didn't change, but the shorter man's hand drifted toward his jacket, and Caleb understood, the way he'd once understood the exact moment a cornered animal decided to stop retreating, that talking had run out of runway. He didn't have his rifle on him. It was still racked over the mudroom door, 20 feet and a locked door away. And for one long second, the math of that distance ran cold through his chest. Headlights swept the tree line before either man moved again. 2 Fremont County cruisers and an unmarked federal sedan came up Route 3 fast, no sirens, and turned into the driveway in a controlled arc that boxed the Suburban against the porch steps. Agent Anand was out of the sedan before it fully stopped, weapon drawn, shouting instructions that put both men on the ground before the shorter man's hand had gotten anywhere near his jacket. It ended in under a minute, no shots fired. Ron arrived 4 minutes later in his own truck, having broken every speed limit on Route 3 once dispatch radioed what was happening, and found Caleb standing on his own porch with his arms around Sadie, who'd unlocked the door the second she heard her father's name shouted by someone official. They found the pistol in the shorter man's jacket, unregistered, serial number filed. They found in the Suburban's glove box a burner phone with 3 calls placed to a number that traced back, over the following weeks of investigation, to a Voss Capital board member named Richard Fenwick, one of the 2 names Eleanor had said in the hospital that she'd trusted completely. Caleb didn't sleep that night either, but for a different reason. He sat on Sadie's bed until well past midnight while she finally drifted off, her hand still gripping the sleeve of his shirt, the same way, he'd think later, Eleanor's had gripped it in the back of the ambulance. Two people who'd learned, in their own separate ways, that the only thing worth holding on to tightly was whoever had actually shown up.
Richard Fenwick was arrested 11 days later at his home in Winnetka, Illinois, the first of 3 Voss Capital board members eventually indicted in a restructuring scheme that would have consolidated voting control of the firm the moment Eleanor was declared dead or incapacitated. Federal prosecutors in the Northern District of Illinois built the case over the following months, wire transfers to a shell company in Wyoming, the same shell that had leased the gray Suburban, and a maintenance log discrepancy at the Lander airstrip showing an unscheduled service window on the Cessna 9 hours before Eleanor's flight. She testified twice, once before a grand jury and once at trial, and both times she did it herself, without a prepared statement written by someone else's hand, because she said she'd spent 11 years letting other people manage her voice, and she wasn't interested in starting that again now. She was discharged from St. John's Health in late October, legs still in a brace, and instead of returning to Chicago, she had her assistant book a room at the Wind River Hotel in Dubois and stayed nearly 3 weeks. She didn't call ahead to Caleb's house. She had Ron drive her out one afternoon unannounced and found Caleb in the side yard building a new set of porch steps, sleeves pushed up despite the cold, sawdust in his hair. He heard the truck before he saw it and was already standing by the time she got out, one hand on Ron's arm for the last few uneven steps across the gravel. "I wanted to hear the place instead of having it described to me," she said. "Ron told me you were building something. I wanted to know what it sounded like." Sadie came around from the backyard a minute later, muddy from digging, and stopped short at the sight of a stranger standing in her driveway. Caleb introduced them plainly. "This is Eleanor, this is Sadie," and Eleanor asked, without any of the careful softness adults usually used with kids they didn't know, whether Sadie wanted to help her guess what kind of wood the new steps were made of just by touching them. Sadie looked at her father, got a nod, and spent the next 20 minutes walking Eleanor's hand along the grain of pine boards like it was the most natural assignment in the world. Eleanor stayed for dinner. Then she stayed the following week in the small guest room at the Wind River Hotel, driving out most afternoons as her leg healed enough to manage the walk unassisted. She didn't rush anything, and neither of them did. Neither of them had built their lives around rushing, and neither saw a reason to start now. By the following spring, she'd redirected a portion of her own fortune, separate from the firm, into a non-profit training center outside Dubois, built to teach search and rescue volunteers to read terrain the way Caleb had, branches, wind, disturbed ground, rather than trusting a grid model alone. She asked him to run it. He said yes, on the condition that Sadie got to name the trail dogs. On the evenings Eleanor drove out to the house, the 3 of them sat on the new porch steps and let the wind move through the pines, and none of them needed to describe what they were looking at to know exactly what had been found.